Hello and welcome to Workday Strategy Session, a brand new show where we'll discover which team was the most agile on track and the quickest to adapt and make the best strategy call at the Belgian Grand Prix. This is a special show for the final 3 European races of the 2022 Formula One season, so stay tuned for 2 more episodes after the Dutch and Italian Grand Prix. With me to bring all of their expertise and insight is former Formula One driver Jolyon Palmer and Bernie Collins. And Bernie, I'm sure you have analysed and adapted Formula One race strategies during your 6 years as head of strategy on the pit wall at Aston Martin.
Yeah, definitely. It's been a long time in the pit wall. This was the first one off the pit wall and sort of seeing it from the outside, so it's really exciting to be fit to look back at it.
Absolutely, and coming up, we're going to take a look at who ran the most successful strategy during the Belgian Grand Prix, and our strategy experts will tell us what else caught their eye, and we'll be looking ahead to the Dutch Grand Prix in Zandvoort to talk about the strategy around that particular circuit. Let's discuss the Belgian Grand Prix then, and Jolyon, what stood out to you from the drives we saw in Spa-Francorchamps?
Obviously the big one was Max Verstappen winning the race from 14th on the grid. I mean, it was quite incredible. It looked like it would be a really close race, but the Red Bull was just too quick. Blasted through the field early on and actually had the race won sort of by the first 5 or 6 laps he was there or thereabouts. But further back, there were some really good drives for the rest of the points. Behind the Red Bulls and the Ferraris, the Alpines, Sebastian Vettel had a good drive, Alex Albon and Pierre Gasly all making some points.
Yeah, plenty to look at further down the field. And Bernie, for you then, who stood out from a strategy point of view?
Yes, I think, as Jolyon mentioned, the strategy was really interesting throughout the field. And it was really, towards the back of the field, some people really stood out in terms of the gains they made. And the one that really stood out to me particularly, as Jolyon sort of mentioned, was the Gasly move. So he actually qualified on the grid in P8 through a technical issue, ended up starting from the pit lane, but then was fit to progress back to the points, so finished in P9. So to come from the pit lane to P9 with not a big car pace advantage was pretty incredible. And I think a lot of that was through the strategy decisions that were made. He only actually took 2 cars on track. So everything else was done through pit lane or incidents for others. The retirements did help, but there was only really 2 of those. So there's quite a lot of positions to be gained just from strategy.
Fantastic. So let's take a look at Pierre Gasly's Sunday afternoon, because a pit lane start when you think you're going to be starting from the grid, I guess things turn completely on their head. From a driver's point of view, what do you do at that point?
Sulk. It's pretty bad. I mean, he qualified, he's due to start in 8th. There was a load of engine penalties, so he actually had a great starting position. AlphaTauri hadn't scored points for 5 races with either car. Yuki Tsunoda, his teammate, was starting from the pit lane, and so Pierre's there as the guy that's going to score the points for AlphaTauri. And then he had an electrical issue on the grid. When you're all prepped, you know what your plan is for the race. Suddenly you're off to the pit lane. He didn't even know if he was going to start the race until a couple of minutes before the race got underway. So your headspace is really scrambled and you're just thinking, OK, if we get going, I've got nothing to lose. Let's just see what happens.
And I guess he knew that Yuki, his teammate, would have been starting from the pit lane. So perhaps there would have been discussions in the engineering room prior to the race start for Yuki. Would Pierre have thought, OK, well, I know what Yuki is going to do, so I guess that's what I'll be doing?
He probably wouldn't have really cared what Yuki was going to do, to be honest. He was due to be starting 8th. Yuki was due to be starting from the pit lane. He had a new power unit, and they were on completely different paths. So probably Pierre was so dialed out for Yuki's part of the briefing that he was thinking, I'm 8th, I've got Daniel Ricciardo just ahead of me, I'm going to have Verstappen and Leclerc coming through. Suddenly, he's in Yuki's position. I hope he was paying attention, but I somewhat doubt it.
And what about you, Bernie, at that point? You've already got 1 car starting in the pit lane. Now you've got another. Do you just do the same as the original car, or do you have to come up with 2 different plans now?
It's quite interesting in this case because the strategist would have went through all of the different plans beforehand and they decided to start Yuki on the hard, but they kept with the medium for Pierre. So they'd either had didn't have time to react, which often in that there's so much going on just to get the car out of the garage that the strategy role doesn't necessarily come straight into it. It's interesting that although Pierre qualified ahead, they sent him out of the pit lane behind. So he did start, dead last. And maybe that was just because, like Jolyon said, they were worried that it wasn't going to make it, but it was fine.
Well, as you say, Pierre started on that medium tyre from the pit lane. So what happened next, Bernie, for Pierre?
Yeah, so I'll just try and show you on the screen. So this is a race trace. This is something that strategists used up and down the pit lane. If I just very quickly explain, this shows all of the drivers, their various lap times. I've set this up with Alonso, the pink. That's his average race. So if he did the same lap time every lap, he would be a straight line. So the laps that go up are quicker than that, then they do a pit stop, and then you can see quicker than their average lap time again. So we can tell quite a lot from this. Pierre is this sort of like darker blue line here. He starts on the medium tyre and gets stuck in traffic. At both pit stops, he stops earlier than everyone else, and that's really what makes and breaks his race from there.
So he stopped earlier than everyone else. Why? Why did they take the gamble?
Yeah, so if I just show you some interesting audio from their side. So this is Pierre just before his pit stop.
I'm on the box. I got 3 more pace.
Okay, Pierre, what we see is just rear tire overheating. It's all thermal. So if we can manage a bit more the rear, the pace will come.
I'm stuck in traffic.
Copy that. At the moment, we're not going backwards. We're monitoring it.
We're not moving forward.
Loud and clear.
So there was a lot of dialogue there going on between Pierre Gasly and his race engineer. And I imagine, Jolyon, you've been in that position where you know how the car is feeling, you know where you are relative to everybody else on track. How do you make your point heard to the race team who, like Bernie says, has a lot of data and a lot of simulation?
I thought he did it pretty well, to be honest. They were obviously coming from completely different train of thought. Pierre was... the driver's always punchy. They always want to go more. I want to go forwards. And obviously they started from the pit lane at the last minute, so they had no time to prep. And I'm surprised, actually, at the time, the race engineers not also trying to be a bit more punchy from being stuck in traffic. So it was actually Pierre really driving that train of thought to take the early pit stop and get out of traffic, which was inevitable when you start from the pit lane.
So at this point, your driver's asking you for something different, Bernie. Do you have simulations that you can go to? Because you're essentially changing what you thought you were going to be up to during the race at this point.
Yeah, so it's really interesting that, Spa, we had really limited running on Friday because of the different track conditions. It was wet. We had no running during the race last year. So the teams have really lacking recent Spa information to work through. So at that stage, a lot of teams were thinking this was still a one stop. And it's actually the teams that reacted quickly to the degradation being much higher than expected. So, for example, it was a different comment on the radio that we've not heard there, but the Ferrari degradation in the first stint on the soft, it was the only car in clear air, it's the only car without traffic. That degradation actually is just reading about 7/10. So that's really high degradation on a tyre. And Gasly doesn't have that information, but the pit wall has that information to be starting to think, we're switching to a two-stop, we've got to get this right. And that'll be what has driven Gasly to do this stop much earlier than anyone else. And it's the team that reacted to that did the best.
So actually, it seems like Pierre probably was paying some attention in the strategy briefing anyway, to know that it's between a 1 and a 2 stop, because he'll know when he's at the back of the field and he's saying, we need to come into the pits, he'll know then that's locking in the 2 stop, whereas others are still sort of hedging their bets at that stage.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in this instance, that drove them to fit the hard tyre. They were having pretty high degradation on the medium, which Gasly can feel. They can see the soft performance on other cars. So then they go for their hard tyre for the middle stint, and that sets the race in motion.
So off he goes then with the hard tyre bolted on, and then obviously stops again. What prompted that next stop?
Yeah, so again, if we just look at the second stop for Gasly and the comms around that.
Think about another stop.
Currently it's too slow, but we keep monitoring. Norris 9/10 behind.
I need to do it early. So much lag.
So, Bernie, why are the team telling him he's too slow at this point?
Yeah, so it's interesting when you look at, if we now look at Gasly's degradation. So the blue line here again, this is actually his final stint. But the team were looking at and saying, degradation's higher than we expected. It's driving us to a 2-stop race. This is around lap 20 that they're having this discussion. So there's 24 laps still to go. In Spa, with a 2-stop race, what you should be doing is splitting your stints really evenly. You should be doing 15 laps on each tyre, and they're talking about doing 24. And that is, an extra 9 laps of degradation that you carry. If you look at, this is Gasly's final stint, so the blue line here, His final lap is around 2.5 seconds off his quickest lap. So the more laps that you do at that end of the scale, the slower your race time is. And that's why the team are telling him it's too early.
So then they must have been looking at other drivers on the grid to gain some sort of inspiration as to what to do. So who were they looking at this point?
So again, the information, I believe, comes from Ferrari. You're sort of at this stage, his first stint was only 10 laps on the medium tyre. They've only got a medium to fit. It's 22 laps to go. So that's big from outside what you've already done. The Ferrari, however, at this stage is on 22 lap old medium tyres. So at this stage, if we just look at the Ferrari trace, this is Leclerc's. He's actually been fit to keep his lap time up to lap 20 reasonably flat. And they have information that the tyre can do that length of stint without totally dropping off. Now, Leclerc hasn't stopped yet. Gasly's going on to lighter fuel. All of that means that it should be possible for Gasly to do a similar stint. There's always questions though, because you've got a very different car. You don't know what he's doing exactly. So it's always a risk. But in this case, between Gasly's feedback and the team, they decided it was worth it.
It seems to me there's a few things at play here. You've got, first of all, Gasly's obviously got no track position, so he's still trying to make something up. But he's actually not had a good middle stint. Didn't make huge gain from the early pit stop initially, but sort of brought him back into play. But then he has an average middle stint, still looking to make time, but he's losing actual lap pace. So when he pits, no one's actually looking to Pierre and thinking we need to cover off Gasly at this stage.
Yeah, so you can see that well here in the race trace. You can see that from this first stop, he does gain position over some cars, but he even loses to, the Aston Martin at this point just because his car pace isn't good enough. But he stops for this final stint 3 laps before anyone else, even people that are fitting the hard tyre, and he's going to the medium. And you're right, people just don't react to it, either feel that this stint's going to be too long, but he's allowed so much free air at this point. One interesting thing is, do they stop Yuki out of his way? Question, not clear. But he has this stint of free air, which isn't particularly quick at the end, as we've shown on the degradation graph. But with the Albon traffic, allows him the opportunity to finish in a position that he would have never been.
And no one covers him off because they don't think that he's going to get to the end.
Exactly. So either people have missed the Leclerc information, or they've just sort of said, different car, they can manage pace, we're not prepared to take that risk with our car. Or, like the pit wall were saying to Gasly, that's going to be too slow. And ultimately this worked for Gasly because Albon in the light blue here, as we've seen, creates this massive train of traffic behind and just protects that position until the end of the race.
Do you think they thought that Albon train was going to happen? Or do you think they just lucked into jumping him and then everyone else got stuck behind? Because that was just the perfect buffer to the end of the race. Yeah,
so when you look at sort of the lap time comparison, so this is Gasly to Albon in the middle stint, when they're both on the hard tyre. And the lap times are really similar, so, he shouldn't have been able to get so far ahead. But I think they did luck in a lot. I think the Albon straight line speed to protect from all those cars behind, as strategists, we look a lot at the numbers, and he shouldn't have had the pace. He shouldn't have been able to keep those cars behind, but he was, just because the straight line speed was so good.
So Bernie, this seems like the perfect combination of the driver and the pit wall working together to make the best strategy call.
Yeah, throughout the race, there was a lot of discussion about the tyre degradation, the model that they were using, and right at the end, they sort of summed that up between them, discussing that they've tried to do the best across both.
Okay, that was pretty long day, I would say.
Man, we started from the pit lane and we scored points.
Okay, very good job today. And you helped us a lot with your feedback on tyres, on strategy. That was a very strong feedback today to help us make the right choices. See you in a bit.
Yeah, can discuss that after. Anyway, thanks guys.
It's the Dutch Grand Prix this weekend, and Zandvoort is a very different track to Circuit de Spa-Francorchamps. So Bernie, what are we expecting in terms of strategy? Is this one that really hangs on the pit wall's shoulders, or is it out on track and track position's king?
Well, I think, very different to Spa. Track position is king in Zandvoort. We've seen last year a number of one-stop strategies, very difficult to overtake, much lower lap time, much shorter lap. So lots of very different, people need to very quickly turn their head around from Spa, what happened last week, and get into Zandvoort. Lots of little changes. You know, one of the big things here is this weekend we're expecting really consistent track conditions throughout. So temperatures, wind, everything very similar. But we've had so little running here. We've only had 1 year in the past. Very different cars, very different tyres. The tyres go one step harder than they were last week at Spa. So the hard tyre is a different compound than it was in Spa. We've only ran that at 3 events this year, so it's going to be a big learning curve for the teams. They've not got a lot of experience on that hard tyre. Is it going to be enough that it can be a one-stop this year? Or is the degradation, as we've seen throughout the year, much higher than last year? Is that going to really drive the two-stop despite the track position?
Jolien, as a driver then, how difficult is it approaching a weekend like the Dutch Grand Prix when you're not quite sure how it's all going to play out? Are you going to have to do some overtakes, or are you going to have to really work with your engineers on the pit wall to find those opportunities?
I think it's going to be important qualifying. I don't think anyone's going to win from 14th on the grid at Zandvoort. It's just not the same track as it is in Belgium. So qualifying will be more important. And then in some ways, once you've got your qualifying slot nailed down, the strategy is going to be crucial, because overtaking is difficult. If you can jump 1 or 2 cars in the pits, it's going to make a big play. The faster cars won't be able to come through. It'd be a little bit like the Alex Albon Q, maybe, for this weekend again.
Making your car extra wide so that no one can make those overtakes. I loved that picture that Alex Albon put up of stretching his car out wide to stop everyone behind him.
Yeah, it was really good. And I think, like Julien says, there's a lot to be gained or lost, you know. Stopping 1 lap too late can make such a big difference in track position, particularly if the deg's a bit higher than expected. So it's going to be a lot to play for on the pit wall this week, I think.
Well, that is great news, because it means there will be plenty to discuss next week after the Dutch Grand Prix and another Workday strategy session. Jolien Palmer and Bernie Collins, thank you so much for your expert analysis and insight. We'll be back with another episode after Zandvoort.